nothing says New Year like board meetings.
A little energy goes a long way.
Both sides don't come prepared to it.
Yeah, exactly. Take notes.
And then their ability to provide a high level KPI to a board member on what that means is very, very novice at best.
I think it's just more complex, right?
It tends to be like most meetings are, kind of death by PowerPoint.
Yeah, I glanced at it.
Pause me mid-tracks, probably like 2 minutes in. He goes, hey, Sean, you have a mentor, right? I was like, yeah. He goes, you should ask him how to present to a board.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Cheat Code.
Hello, once again. Well, I shouldn't say once again because it's the start of a season, but you're back with the Cheat Code insert record skip because, of course, I think in line with every season of this show, we've changed the name slightly. So this season, we are now branding this as Cheat Code and Friends, and you'll see why here as we get further into the conversation. But I shouldn't say that we're devoid of friends today because, as always, I'm joined by my two partners at In Revenue. But Sean doesn't always make an appearance on the podcast in the past, but he's going to be a regular on this season. And so far in this inaugural episode, it's the three of us, but each week we'll kind of have a rotating lineup of folks that we think can come in and talk on a variety of subjects. But the first three seasons kind of did their job as the book has been shipped at this point. It's hit the market. Wags, what's your take on the reception so far?
Yeah, honestly, it's been really good. You know, we've had some unsolicited feedback from people even outside the network, which I would say is probably the most powerful thing. I know you and I have received a couple random LinkedIn folks that are like new connections that we didn't know before. And I think the one that was my favorite was bought the book on a recommendation. Usually these sales books fall down as soon as you open them and start reading them. But you guys, this was really well written and very articulate and tactical.
Yeah, you're like getting like drink spot for you at bars and
that was cool.
Places.
That was cool too. I wasn't going to bring that one up and be a little more subtle, but yeah. So we've gotten some really good feedback even from outside the network. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but I mean, that was to say, I haven't even gotten the book yet. I had to take one from the office.
Did you order?
A little bit disappointed. I didn't order it. I just expected I would get one.
But yeah, I don't know. Like that whole shipping situation is such a clusterfuck, and that's the joys of working with a traditional publisher and so on. But long story short, the book is out. The Go-to-Market Cheat Code. If you haven't picked it up, would highly recommend that you do so. Not just because I wrote it, but as Josh mentioned, just a lot of the feedback that we've gotten on it. It did go. It got listed as a national bestseller by USA Today. It's been number one on Amazon in 4 or 5 categories. So you can pick it up, wherever books are sold. But certainly, the purpose of the podcast in the beginning was kind of, getting in front of go-to-market leaders, getting their takes that we could integrate with the book. And so now that has become a reality, kind of needed to pivot a bit here. And frankly, the episodes that we've done on this show that have just been us kind of talking about recent happenings and kind of insights, from a B2B tech and go-to-market wrapper have certainly done the best. And so we'll be doing that, going forward and certainly inviting, some folks that we respect and that are, have, pretty voiced and recognizable opinions within the overall B2B tech ecosystem to join us and kind of, give their topics and insights on the show as well. So bit of an inaugural episode, bit of a, just kind of level set here. And, we'll just get into some things that certainly we're seeing in our own backyard as we're starting another new year. And of course, nothing says New Year like board meetings, which I feel like we're just kind of coming off the tail of, which I don't know. My take on board meetings is most of them are just completely, well, they should be worthless from our perspective because we're so involved in the business outside of that. But even through the lens of like it being like a highly advisory centric kind of like, hey, how's the business performing? What are the start stops and continues? And hey, what do we need help with type of forum? Just tends to be like most meetings are, kind of death by PowerPoint. So I know you guys have seen a lot of this as well, like similar, happenings and feedback going on in where you're sitting, or like, I guess also anyone that stands out to you.
At least in the generally speaking, I think both sides don't come prepared to it, right?
Yeah.
The board member and the this is usually the CEO. So from what we've seen from, at least in our portfolio and what I've seen it from at the seed stages, they don't have a deck, they don't share it beforehand. And if they do, kind of slap together last minute, could be a bunch of errors in it. And it doesn't give anyone the ability to prep ahead of time and actually add value. So you're kind of going in there, I don't know, they're kind of spitting a bunch of information at you and you're trying to be helpful. But, by and large, like everyone's got to show up.
To the end. So, I think, everyone certainly has a deck the day of, right? Like, but the prep is what everyone asks for. But from the other side, like most of the feedback I get, on the co-invest, the other folks on the cap table is like, yeah, I glanced at it, I haven't really had a chance to take a look over it, so on and so forth. But yet every single meeting, there's also the request for like more and more information, and earlier information. So to your point, I think, there has to be a give and take and a two sides of the coin situation there.
Yeah, as we're sitting on several boards now in different capacities. And I think less about just the meeting itself and more about the overall board and the board structure. And then you think about the stage of the companies that we're advising and then how boards evolve over time as companies grow. And specifically at the stage we're advising, the CEOs need a lot, right? Like, I remember this article that you had shared with us, Justin, that kind of had these like 4 different types of boards, right? You had like the controlling board, the just sitting there and listen board, and then kind of in the middle is this mentorship and advisory type of thing. And I feel like we specifically fall somewhere in the middle, but I think it needs some definition even beyond that. Like the granularity of who is the CEO, what do they need, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and then how do we round out the board accordingly. So one of I think the biggest faults maybe that we have is at the seed stage where we invest, the board is investors, right? So
Sure.
They kind of have a singular purpose and a singular view. I think there should be maybe a more concentrated, like, what do they need from the outside? Someone who's not, who hasn't written a check, but fills a gap very specifically. I think that could be an interesting way to think about this board configuration early on.
Well, at the same time, where we've seen advisory board members, they tend to be, I'll just say, be very transparent. They tend to be, in my opinion, these kind of hangers on that kind of seek out companies that have gone through certain cohorts like Techstars or White3. Right. Again, I'm speaking from like a fairly small, we sit on, a half dozen boards at this point, like fairly small data set, but even prior to that, I haven't seen anything that counteracts this, which is that they're more of a camp counselor than anything, versus like someone that's like really been in that operator seat and can provide like, tactical advice for what that, and probably more importantly, like look around corners and see what that founder can expect. So to the point, no one's adopted a framework that's like highly effective and held to a rigid standard as well.
I agree. No matter who, so a couple of things I thought about last night. No matter who's on your board, the board structure should be talked about. But there's a couple of things that early boards, especially at the seed round, should be teaching CEOs. And one is how to present to a board. Like, here's what we expect, and here's what you're going to be expected to say as you move forward. Series A, B, C, etc. So they start to build that muscle. They understand the things that matter. I remember in particular at SalesLoft, I was asked to come to one of our first board meetings and present a roadmap, and like 30 minutes beforehand, and I had not created a roadmap yet. And so I just started, feature dumping to the board, and Jason Grain of Emergence like paused me mid tracks, probably like 2 minutes. Then he goes, "Hey, Sean, you have a mentor, right?" I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "You should ask him how to present to a board." And I was like, "Oh shit." So, from that moment on, I realized that one, I had no idea what I was doing, but two, how important it is. The second one is, I think, how to raise a round. We see, they've raised a seed round, but a lot of that is, it's right after an angel. There's some formality to it, but not as much as an A and a B, and from an expectation standpoint. So I think boards should be coaching them on how to raise a round, and then how to build a story around the business that is compelling to tell from a vision perspective, right? And so I think we're seeing some of that pain as, we have portfolio companies going into their next rounds, is that A lot of them have been coached on this. And I think, looking in hindsight, like these are things that we should be able to add value to. But specifically when talking about generic boards at a seed level, like these are value that they should be adding to that conversation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like if you were to give a presentation, any host of forums, or like you would practice that ahead of time, probably run it by different folks. I never find that's the case in a board setting, and if it is, it's run by other team members within that organization, largely looking for feedback and so on. Now, we do have a couple founders that have done this actually fairly recently, and one that I think did a good job on like previewing with every single board member, because they mentioned that they were going around and doing that, right? And I found that exercise just to be super effective and like gave you the narrative that's going to be overlaying those slides that largely should be table stakes. Like it's the narrative that provides all the value there. So, just previewing that, getting advisors, as you mentioned, to run that type of stuff by, and then holding the board accountable to what you need from them every meeting, like that level set, that never happens. And, I try to do that with a couple of our founders. And frankly, the feedback has been like, yeah, we've tried that before, which even to your other point, like it's not super applicable, because like, all right, now you're taking, we should probably define what, we call seed, which is certainly like quote unquote in revenue, as the name states, over 500K, and we normally don't make an investment less than $1 million in ARR. So like this is a different type of situation now. You're stepping into, some semblance of the big leagues. You've got folks that have put in substantial amounts of money. You should be able to expect something from them, and you should certainly come to the meeting knowing that they're expecting something from you. So level setting what that is right up front, I will say never has happened. And I think, the founder would probably retort that, we just don't get a lot of value from that side. And of course, my, counterpoint to that is you're not defining what value you want. And so it's this catch-22 situation that I think just leads to all these, articles that everyone's publishing. Will pop a couple in the show notes that kind of brought this topic up internally. It's the same advice every time, and yet no one takes it. And, I think that just really anchors the point that like you have to do something. Like these are all great pieces of advice, but like you have to do something uncommon within your own business and with your board to create that alignment.
Yeah, maybe we were talking about this. It made me think of one of my favorite board meeting stories. And it wasn't me. It was my brother. When he was in college, he was fortunate enough to intern with the CEO of PF Chang's at the time. That guy named Rick Federico. He was the person who took them public into IPO. And he spent 2 weeks with every member of the C-suite during his internship. And then Rick invited him to a board meeting. And the way he told this story just blew my mind. He said, the deck was sent out 2 weeks in advance. They all were required to read it. If they didn't get a chance. There was no like update in the meeting. It was.
And what should they judge that? How did they know if someone did their homework?
Yeah, it was basically you had to have questions that were very pointed and specific to what was in the material. It wasn't like, give me an overview on the finance. Like you need to have read the financial statement and know what's going on with finance, right? Like you can't say, what's our burn? Well, our burn is in the financial document.
Right.
You know that, right? So eventually, what happens, he says, I get in this boardroom, I'm sitting there like a fly on the wall in the corner, and all these suits, because, it's a public company. So all these Wall Street suits come in and they start filling out this conference table. And then he said, Rick Federico comes in jeans, loafers, and a Hawaiian shirt. Slowly sits at the head of the table. He sits down, and then he just goes, all right, section 1, what do you got? And they would rapid fire questions at him. He would answer them very quickly. And then at the end of each section, there was a decision that had to be made. And he said the most mind-blowing thing to him was this is a, $1 billion company, and he was making decisions in an instant. It was just thoughts. Everyone would look to Rick, decision, move on. And that was the pace of the board meeting. And he said it took, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it needed to get through whatever that agenda was. But I think the point of that is the preparation, right? Having all of your ducks in a row with all of your key functional teams ahead of time that are delivering that information to all the board members. Not just the information, but saying, okay, out of this information, we have some decisions we need to make. And these decisions are going to come up in the meeting. And you're going to have this much time to give your 2 cents. But ultimately, the chairman and CEO is going to take the final stamp and we're going to move on. So I think there's a lot of roles and responsibilities and preparation and functional analysis that goes on there. But I thought it was just a fascinating story. It's one of the spectrum of ours.
It's why I love that like stop, start, continue framework. But the minute that you say that term, it immediately gets like boiled down into some BS like framework that, that people try to like put in 3 columns. Like that's how that should run. Like these are the things that worked, these are the things that didn't. And then, what do I need to modify, and, ultimately what feedback do I need from you, my informed advisors, to make those decisions?
Yeah. The thing that you were just saying prior of, well, we've tried that before. We've tried to make asks and it never works or whatever. What if we framed it as decisions? Like these are the decisions that need to be made in this meeting, and it requires this group to make that decision, right? And you said, look around the corners. Okay, someone should be piping their head in to say, ooh, have we thought about it from this angle? You know what I mean? Like that to me is where the value comes in.
Yeah, all it tells me when someone tries to, have that kind of reaction is like, well, then something you did wasn't effective. So it's not just that we abandoned the principle, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
what can you do to make that work?
Yeah, I mean, the board meeting should not just be a business update. I mean,
Correct.
that story can be told in spreadsheets and decks, and so that's, I think, to add value on both sides. Just going back to the beginning, you've got to come prepared. I love sending it out 2 weeks ahead of time. At this stage, I don't know if that's possible on its search, but a few days ahead of time. But to your point, Josh, like there's 3 things we need to decide, and here they are, and then here's all the data to back it up. Like, let me know what you think. Like, we're going to talk about it, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, the area that I find is always the weakest, which is ironic because it's probably the area that we care most about, is that go to market aspect. Number one, I feel like everyone's got like the Big 10. If you don't have them, like the Big 10 metrics that every board is going to want to know. Largely, it's the exec dashboard. Like we've got frameworks on the site, so if you don't have them, steal them from there. But the go-to-market section never gets that same amount of preparation or science applied to it. It's largely just pipeline updates, right? Like what's pipe look like for this month? How did we perform in the past? And what are some general activities? People love to talk about like trade shows and events and things like that they have coming up, and the kind of the arts and crafts element of things. But the other thing that I feel like gets a ton of attention there is like new technologies that folks are trying, because frankly, the narrative I think we all hear most often is like nothing's working, or certainly nothing's performing at the level that they were either told it would or had seen in the past. So just kind of like that whole black hole of go to market. And I think that needs to be a huge staple within, a board meeting, and certainly on those, quarterly updates coming off of an initial budget rollout, or, just kind of a reset as we're seeing quite frequently. And so, the high level points get a lot of focus, but rarely is someone saying like, this is how this is performing for us. It's lower than expected. Here's, again, to what we were just talking about, like, what have you seen, from someone who's experiencing the same issues, or like, what are you seeing in the rest of your portfolio? And here's the data to back it up. The data is very rarely there. And if it is, like, someone pokes a hole in it immediately, and the entire conversation becomes around like those gaps and like, how are you going to fill them?
Yeah, I think go to market becomes a black hole for, especially at this stage, right? I mean, it gets more refined as you go, you would think, right? But
You would hope.
Yeah, you would hope, right? But I think it just becomes a black hole because, especially early stage founders, they typically bucket things like marketing, sales into tactical things, right? And then their ability to provide a high level KPI to a board member on what that means is very, very novice at best. So it's just like, we made 5,000 calls this month and 10 connects. You know what I mean? It just becomes this horrible scenario. So even like sitting,
you get the dog pile of like, have you tried this like AI, sales assistant? Like, why don't we just get rid of our SDR, BDR team, so on and so forth? Like,
we had a founder write one.
Yeah. And like very proud of it. Right. And to some extent, all right, great. Thanks for taking the initiative and so on. And certainly it's worth the experiment.
Yeah.
But, I guess this kind of gets back to, oh man, what was that quote? I was watching Rosenberg's podcast the other day, and he had actually a VC on who was talking about like this, the technology, myth that we built up is like everything went to digital, which is of course like the entire thesis for the book, and like the return to what is really the largest asset in go to market, which is relationships. And no one's ever leveraging those, certainly within that room, but also outside of that. Like, how am I going to, get access to my ideal buyer or the partners that have those relationships already? Like, those are really the areas that I don't see any narrative around, not only in board meetings, but, long term from a strategy perspective.
Yeah. I think because there is such a black hole of what's working and what's not, marketing and sales to a certain extent is becoming extremely experimental. And people are just trying to throw things at the wall, but without a process in order to do it. Right. So one of the examples I love to use is I'm an advisor at this one company. It's a small little software startup. And listen, they don't do everything right, but we get together for advisory once a month and they give me a download. Everything they try, they track it. They have a report on it. They say how it's converting, how it's not converting. And they say, we're getting stuck here. I can count on it every single time. And then we talk about it. We come up with some new ideas and these freaking guys try it. It doesn't matter what I say. They freaking try it.
As a team, right? As a team, you need the data in order to prescribe.
They try it, they track it, and they report on it. So it becomes, now they've built this playbook, and I think I may have loaded it in one of our framework box folders, but they call it like the Tom Brady demo. And it's just this like demo of excellence.
Deflates balls.
Yeah, deflates balls so you could throw it harder and catch it easier. Yeah. But it's, these guys are they're extremely experimental, but they track and report on it and they measure it. That's the thing, is everything becomes anecdotal. Oh, well, we tried this trade show. We tried this SDR bot. We tried this thing. Well, what does tried mean? You tried it for a day? You tried it for an hour? You tried it for 3 weeks?
Well, to your point, like who tried it? You know what I mean? Like the thing we find certainly in early stages, everyone's doing their own thing. Reminds me of that old Sesame Street song. Like, no one's following, like, Sean, I know you ran into this, like, with a particular organization. Like,
oh, they use some Sesame Street knowledge.
Like, but how, I mean, like, everyone was running, like, literally individual sequences for every single prospect.
It was like 2,500 sequences with like 6 sales reps. And like 4,000 templates, and again 6 sales reps. And so the amount of times they were changing things, it felt like, and I'm sure it was, on the daily. And so they'd send out a handful. When I say handful, like 10, 15, they'd get 1 or 2 responses back. That's not enough of the data set, and also they don't feel like that's a huge win because they're only getting 2 or 3 responses. So they'd change it the next day and so on and so forth. And then there's no scientific way to do it, and then there's no way to see how do you mimic your best rep is if they're all doing the same thing. Like the most dangerous thing when I was leading a sales team is having your best rep do something different every day, because they are your best, but there's just no way to copy it.
Well, it's funny. I'm sitting in a portfolio company's office right now, and right before I jumped on this podcast, the founder goes, "Hey, the team's heading out to a conference tomorrow. You got any best practice tips for what to do at a conference?" I'm like, "Well, wow, I got
one. Where are your ring tips?"
1 minute right here. But to your point, Sean, that my knee-jerk response was everyone needs to be saying the exact same thing, asking the same question, and trying to get the same input so that we can use it for some very strategic follow-up. And that was what I can come up with on the quick. But to your point, like consistency, right? Consistency in message, consistency in approach. What are we trying to understand? And based on what we understand, how do we thread that into something that means something to the prospect?
The answer to that question, I believe firmly, like the question of like, hey, what's working, is fundamentals. Right? Like we've gotten so used to and expectant that like something has to be hyper new, it has to be hyper like hacky, and like the whole growth hacking thing, right? Like it has to be like this trick. Like what are we gonna pull out of our bag for this show that's just gonna like blow everything away? And like time after time, like whether we're evaluating new companies or speaking to like very established, they are finding success with the fundamentals. And that is like, can you explain your product very simply and rooted to a pain that exists within your buyer? Do you know your buyer really well? Do you know who has relationships with those buyers and holds their trust? Are you carving paths into those individuals and transferring that trust because you're able to give them value first and then ultimately their customer value? Like these are things that are not complex, but they are, I think, counterintuitive and counter to the narrative that still exists out there. And they take effort and they are an art. And I think when you put all those things together, it's far too daunting for a lot of folks out there, and just seems like it's going to have a runway that's much longer. But we've got a very recent example of this, but we all know a rep who's really in an early stage company that has taken the time to really build out that ecosystem, and it took damn near 9 months to start seeing the traction of that. But like, put in the time to go through partners, put in the time to go through established spaces where trust was being held, and now that is starting to just windfall for them. And meanwhile, the reps that were putting up the activities that, frankly, the CEO was like, why can't I get rep A, who I was just talking about, to perform like rep B through Z in terms of activity and motion, and it feels really good. Now the scales have completely tipped, and now it's like, why aren't they built? They're conducting all this activity, but there's no pipeline coming out the other end. Versus now you're seeing like really big enterprise, like game-changing deals for this organization that took time to build up, but they are, I mean, when I say game-changing, like doubling, tripling, quadrupling the revenue of that organization, with very few of these deals actually landing. And so, but it's because you make that investment, and frankly, I think it's the confidence to know this is going to yield fruit. I just need to know what those motions look like.
Yeah, we tend to you tend to see people step over the simple things, right? And lure something super, super sexy, right? Like, just don't talk your prospect's ear off. Probe a little bit, like ask them a question and see what they say, and then use their answer in a meaningful way later in the conversation.
Yeah, are you going into that call thinking about what you need to learn from them to be successful? Or are you going in thinking, what do I need to tell them so I'm successful? And I think just even that mentality leads to night and day results.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
I was going to say, there's one common thread there. And at least at all of our portfolio companies where we've seen this struggle, is that there's a lack of sales leadership and a lack of ongoing training, right? So you get a bunch of sales reps in a room and you're just to go fire away. They're all going to start doing something differently. There's no one holding them accountable. So I think, fundamentally, you need someone who's going to control that ship, whether they're a head of sales, VP of sales, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you need somebody who's going to do it. Start with a team lead, start with someone who still holds a bag. But if no one's holding the rest of them accountable, you're never going to get consistency.
Yeah, I think the question is, like, when early stage companies hear training, they think of like this big heavyweight, like LMS enablement motion. And Josh, what you're doing out, where you're at right now, like, is what I think is effective training early stage, which is like, all right, let's communicate the process, and then let's listen to calls. Like, how do I get into those conversations and provide that immediacy of feedback that's going to like really click with people? And that's where I see the gap, certainly on, founder-led selling, or founders that start building out a team and them, and they're like, I can't find anyone that they can do things like I'm doing it. Well, the answer is, like, you're asking someone to step in blind and do that. And good reps can put together a lot of those pieces, but you need to, you don't know what you don't know. The old adage is true. Like, you need to be able to like see that and course correct really quickly.
Yeah, I think it takes a little bit of just that leader, Sean, to your point. Like, the mentality that they have has to be that curiosity-driven mentality. Like, listen, I know how I operate, but I need to step in and listen to what the sales team is doing. How is the buyer reacting? What do they react well to? What do they just like turn around and run from? And then how can I take my natural proclivity to run a deal and apply it to this thing, right? You hear so many times, like, there's this dichotomy between people like, okay, I need the sales leader who's got the playbook and they know how to run it. And then you hear the other side of it is, your playbook that you did at Sales Loft isn't going to work at LeadMD, right? So how are you adapt your playbook, right? And it's like all things, it's probably somewhere in between, right? You have a general framework that you operate against. Like, I know how I operate. I operate a certain way. It doesn't mean it's right or it's wrong, but the way I operate, I can adapt into what I learn about the buyer, the prospect, and the company. And I've heard a lot of, well, you can't apply an enterprise sales mentality to SMB. Like, well, that's not necessarily true,
What
right?
is an enterprise sales mentality?
To me, it's just like getting to know a lot of people and finding out what hurts the most people, and then, pulling it together in a solution that fixes the biggest problem for the most people, right? Like that. So how is that any different than just doing it for one person, right? And
Well, yeah, I think it's just more complex, right? You got to stick a move at a smaller stage, when you've got a smaller deal size, but you still need to understand their pain points and what they care about, who else is involved in the deal, and who's going to sign.
You have to find the thread to pull on either way, right? Hopefully, you unravel the thimble faster in an SMB deal than you do in a enterprise deal. But I think the fundamentals are still there. The reps who move up and move up and move up, they tend to thrive in that complexity and that, figuring out who all the moving pieces are and all the politics and this and that. But shoot, if you're a really good volume and velocity rep, you can make just as good a living if you're doing the same thing over and over again, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a the reason I asked on the enterprise side is like I feel like the notion is like either a volume and velocity side is like product driven, and the enterprise is like this complicated sales motion. Like in both of them, again, you have to do the fundamentals, which is what is your pain? How do I make you identify with my solution being the ultimate resolution to that pain? And how do we set next steps and ultimately a plan to get you across the line in a way that we both agree upon? Like whether you're doing that for a big committee or to your point, a buyer of one, you still have to do the fundamentals.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna switch over to our last topic, but go ahead if you got something else there.
No, I was going to apply the same thinking to partnerships, right? Because we talk about partnerships a lot in the book, and it's one of our core go-to-market functions. And especially in early stage companies, it's like, okay, how do I unlock partnerships? I need a partner leader who's been there, done that. And I think the unlock for me early on was, frankly, working with you, Justin, and at LeadMD, and it was like, go sell, go be a salesperson, but go sell through partners, right? Go figure out how to use them to build your pipeline. And like, it's, again, you're stepping over something very simple, but like, I need to sell stuff. My partners have access to the people I want to sell to. So how do I connect the dots? What's the thread I can pull with them? And it's just a simple thing that we walk over too often for, partnership agreements, referral agreements, affiliate partners. How are we going to integrate? How are we going to do this? There's all these things that you could spin your wheels doing when it's like, what partners have access to my customers and how do I do something valuable for them?
Did you guys see, like, speaking of people that have been stepping over this for a long time, did you see the uptick or just the general results that HubSpot just put up, but specifically around their partner revenue, Jen?
Yeah,
like it's increased by, I want to say 64%, but just, massive gains from finally embracing the partner channel there versus like, hey, we're agnostic and like we're only going to embrace the partners that are driving the most leads to us. But really recognizing that for what it is, which is like the relationship holder to the customer that in their world they want to sell a host of new products to, whether it's their AI stuff, their service, cloud stuff, even CRM still. Like there's just so much opportunity to expand within that existing base. They're doing a great job of winning new logos as well, but like, I feel like that's that like net new transactional based mentality shifting over into a more enterprise centric deal mentality, which is just consultative, which is great. Like, let me find all the folks that can impact my solution and frankly, my sale, and let me figure out a way to impact them.
Yeah, for sure.
So the last item I wanted to get you guys take on is just, the CEO DNA that's leading to success these days, right? Like I think we've all had a ton of conversations in-house about just the efficacy of certain CEO traits and, kind of either you've got it or you don't type of a situation. Even though our portfolio is not gigantic, you can definitely see some trends emerge there. But when you start to apply that to, partners of ours and just the ecosystem that we operate in, I think there's some pretty big trends that have started to emerge. And frankly, one of those learnings for me has just been like marketing-based CEOs have been really difficult to on the whole, in terms of performance of the company. I think the other is like CEOs that are so far away from go to market and don't have that ability. It's not even to sell to customers, but to sell to internal staff and get them aligned and excited about a narrative and a unique take on the market, the product, whatever it happens to be. So there's definitely some skills that I feel like are front and center when we're evaluating new deals that we're looking for. Similar question, like what's emerging out there to inform these other two topics that we talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally drawn to a particular trait, but I think it is pretty universal, and we're seeing it materialize here. There can be a lot of other shortcomings, but the visionary who can clearly articulate that vision over and over and over again rises to the top very, very quickly. They may not be the best operator. They may not be the best this. They may not be the best that. But that clear, articulate communication of the vision consistently makes a massive difference in excitement of employees, excitement of board members, excitement of investors. Like, it is an insanely attractive quality that I think pushes a lot of the other stuff to the side. Maybe that won't last forever. Maybe that only works in the early stage. But I think if you know your weaknesses.
I think you're spot on. I would just say it's a self-aware visionary.
There you go. I like that a lot. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a part of that organization with that person, and I can tell you it affects the business from a top down, like across the board. And on every facet of the business, everyone starts speaking the same language. So you've got your intern to your SDR to your sales reps to your marketing leader to product and engineers all talking about what it is that they're trying to achieve and why they're trying to achieve it, and boiling it down to a very, very like elevator pitch style message. It resonates at the board level. It resonates when you're trying to raise more rounds, and you can easily go pitch that what the vision is and what you're trying to achieve. And I'm talking about just not, we're trying to help these customers do this, and here's why. It's like, and here's the revenue that we're going to get to, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's the manner in which we're going to do it, and here's what we have in place, and so on and so forth. So I couldn't agree more. The second piece is, I think, there's two more I'd like to add. One, the idea that you have to learn faster than your experiences. So when you're a CEO and you're anyone within a startup, you're moving quickly. You are all replaceable if you're not able to learn faster than your failure. So you need to go find folks, whether it be a mentor or someone else in the market or people to follow that have done that before or are doing it at a bigger level than you, that you can align with and understand what is it they're doing, they're working, what applies to me, how can I take on those traits? Because as you're scaling, like you've heard this before, you've got a VP that can get you from 1 to 10 to 50 to 100. Like, that's not always necessarily true if they learn faster than experience. Now, it may feel comfortable there, and that might be their sweet spot. But if they really want to stay on with the organization, and that goes all the way up to the CEO level, like the board can take you out and do it. So you need to learn faster in your experiences, because you get to CD round, and you're getting $1 billion valuation. Like, there's a whole bench of CEOs they know they can do this job, right? And like, are you the one to carry that on? Finally, having a customer obsessed CEO. Someone who is going to go make sure that the customer is always first and foremost, and that transcends the organization. And so everything you do, whether it be from customer advisory boards to events, to having your own conference, to the way you have the messaging on your website, like, it's got to be custom first, because a dollar in the bank is not worth as much of ARR, right? So it's like, you can have money, but having that customer and being able to expand them, and having really happy customers, because you'll just create this referral network where you'll start having some exponential growth on existing customer revenue.
So basically, we cracked the code on it. Your job description reads curious, self-aware, visionary, right?
There you go.
And so send your applications over to us.
The email streams like challenge too. Like investors love someone who could overcome a challenge. Like, you also have to have gone through some hardship and succeeded at overcoming it.
I mean, that is the one thing I think is consistent above amongst all the examples that we mentioned. Like, they are experts at interviewing and frankly, like the hiring process and getting really deep on how do I uncover those traits that we just talked through, not simply by asking the question, but by asking questions that are very relevant to day-to-day behavior that are going to indicate the ultimate skill sets that you're looking for. So
maybe we should add one more to the list, which is recruiting. That's another key, add them to the list, but like, you should be spending at least a third of your time trying to find talent, especially in the early stage, because you can't afford to have bad hires.
Yeah, you're never not hiring for talent. Like that's an always on spigot, certainly.
And I've heard a couple of our portfolio CEOs that have been like, that's a lot of my time. Like, no kidding. You know, like you're that's a lot of your money too that's going to go towards them.
Well, in the spirit of self-awareness, right? Like if you're reflecting and you're a founder or CEO and you're thinking about, what's my natural, where do I lean naturally? I think the biggest hill to climb is for product-centric and engineering CEOs, right? Their natural personality, and this isn't a knock, just doesn't encompass that type of communication style, right? They are process driven. They have inputs and outputs in their life. Those inputs and outputs produce a certain thing when you're writing code and you're engineering and you're building a product, right? The natural way people communicate with one another just always work that way. There's a little bit of politics involved. And
it's like, so if you have that gap, again, I think that's where the self-awareness comes in. Like you have to, stack the deck, stack your team with folks that can fill that gap, quite frankly. So but it's interesting. I mean, like, I think the summation there is like people are truly all that matters. Like if we look at our, upper quartile folks, like they have been able to assemble great teams that certainly augment, where they're weak. So not a surprising thing. I think it comes back probably to the entire, what has become the theme of this first episode, which is, fundamentals, like embracing those. And it sounds boring, but man, there's a lot of low hanging fruit to be captured there.
So guys, the 100 things that we listed and you'll be set.
Yeah, exactly. Take notes.
A little energy goes a long way. How about that?
Yeah. So I think next week we'll be able to dive, or get some different perspective on some of these topics, because we'll actually have someone I consider to be a great CEO on the podcast. So that is the next time that we'll see each other. But thanks for tuning in again to kind of this inaugural first episode. Thanks for, working out some of the kinks with us. Going forward, we'll be joined each week, as I mentioned, by an interesting guest. And if you're listening and you want to pop onto the show and have kind of a unique take to contribute, hit us up, and hopefully we'll see you on a future episode. That's it for the go-to-market, or the Cheat Code and Friends. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, guys. And we'll talk next week.